According to the Data Institute at the University of San Francisco, historically, epidemics are a time of fear, confusion, and helplessness because men are faced with danger and uncertainty. And at least according to human psychology, man has only two choices in the face of crisis: fight or flight. Some men run and some men stay, some men fight and some men flee. But fortune, at least in the Ranger Regiment, always favors the bold. Hello, my name is Major Mike Webb, retired Army Ranger and formerly the Operations Officer for all U.S. Army Strategic Counterintelligence in the continental United States. And when an invisible enemy that emerged in China had traveled to the United States, when most everyone began to run away, closing businesses, churches, and schools, placing social distance between themselves and others, and doing anything that they could to avoid confronting a novel coronavirus, I decided to do things just a little bit different. I decided to do it the Ranger way and became a person determined to catch COVID-19 in court. And the following are true crime stories that arose in my determination to catch COVID-19. According to Scott McCaffrey, the editor for the Arlington Sun-Gazette, bookies probably wouldn't even lay odds on the chance of Republicans picking up the 8th Congressional District seat in Virginia because it seems so out of reach. When McCaffrey said that in 2016, it was just a D+15 Congressional District. But in 2016, it will be the top gaining Democrat district in the country, gaining 6 points, and today it is a D+27 district, according to the Cook Partisan Voting Index. Mark Rozelle, Dean of the Schar School of Public Policy and Government at George Mason University, in 2022 was convinced that the real race for Congress in this district is always the Democratic nomination, the outcome of which is tantamount to election in November. And describing the 5 candidates seeking the Republican nomination, he believed that these are make-a-statement candidates, playing to a small far-right base in that district, but hoping to differentiate herself from the pack, channeling the spirit of Georgia Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who had introduced the Fauci Act, Carl Lipsman, who had claimed to be a national security professional with almost a decade of experience, who could listen to an intelligence briefing and be prepared to make a decision on day one, told potential Republican voters in the nomination convention to much applause, Fauci should be jailed. We all know that, and then went on to win the nomination. However, that was before capturing the Republican nomination and probably raising more in donations than any prior candidate in the recent past, raising over $60,000. But moving closer to the center after capturing the nomination, the Lipsman campaign issued an immediate official statement walking back her prior position and saying, "I do not believe Dr. Fauci should be jailed." However, according to her statement, Lipsman said that she did believe Dr. Fauci and other government officials involved need to be held accountable for the actions taken during the COVID-19 pandemic that wreaked havoc on our economy, our children, and our country. And to charge, indict, and prosecute any criminal, you would actually need to have sufficient evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, and not just mere beliefs or campaign promises. It's like a law. But at the very beginning of the current public health crisis, while the novel coronavirus was still what might be probably described on the news as a developing story, rapidly developing story, by April 2020, according to the Pew Research Center, while a plurality of Americans, 43%, said the new coronavirus most likely came about naturally. Nearly 3 in 10, 29%, said it most likely was created in a lab, according to a Pew Research Center survey conducted from March 10th to the 16th, 2020. These dates are significant because it is a public opinion survey conducted in the days just before the online publication of what had become the definitive report on zoonotic evolution, authored by Dr. Christian G. Anderson from Scripps Research Laboratories. And at least before the release of that report, there was sufficient feedback from focus group performance that story would essentially play well in Peoria and not be rejected by a majority, making the timing of that public opinion survey of at least probative value and suspect, especially with its authoritative claim after the report that scientists have determined the virus came about naturally. There was only one report and one scientist, not plural, as claimed by Pew. And before we delve any further into what might be described as a conspiracy theory, let's just first, from a legal analysis perspective, lay down the rules that would apply in a criminal prosecution, set about to establish or refute a prima facie case based upon that available evidence, because at least in a rule of law, you cannot be convicted on just beliefs or just for beliefs, although it may be possible in your imagination. One popular belief amongst opponents of the illustrious Dr. Anthony S. Fauci is that he might lie, which would be an interesting hypothesis, but would, at least in a court of law, require a little more development. And so first we would need some specific statement or group of statements before any attempt at building a solid case or legal claim. And generally crimes about lying would fall under a legal theory of fraud. And in the federal judiciary, there is a distinction between conspiracy claims at large or generally and conspiracies to commit fraud, the latter of which must satisfy Rule 9 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, not just the plain and simple statement required under Rule 8, and which legal scholars and practitioners would describe as a claim requiring a heightened pleading standard, in which all of the allegations for the elements must be pled in court with particularity, supporting each and every element of the offense with at least clear and convincing evidence to proceed further to a criminal charge where all elements must be established beyond a reasonable doubt. Even under Rule 8, however, to survive a motion to dismiss or a demurrer, as practitioners say, under Federal Rule 12b-6, does not require heightened fact pleading of specifics, but only enough facts to state a claim to relief that is plausible on its face. Plaintiffs must nudge their claims across the line from conceivable or wholly conceivable to plausible, or their complaint must be dismissed. That's just for a normal case without pleadings of fraud. So there is a heightened standard when you're talking about fraud. And to avoid the charge of crackpot theorists, at least in law school, students are taught a very simple methodology to develop a legal argument that has been given the acronym IRAC, Issue, Rule, Analysis, Conclusion. So let's use this as our framework to set out for Iraq, beginning with the issue of fraud as described by a controlling rule. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, a party alleging fraud must prove by clear and convincing evidence at least 1, a false representation, 2, of a material fact, not just anything, 3, made intentionally and knowing, 4, with intent to mislead. 5, reliance by the party misled. And 6, resulting damage to him. 6 elements, all of which have to be proved. All or none. For this issue-based framework, clear and convincing evidence is such proof as will establish in the trier of fact, often a jury, a firm belief or conviction concerning the allegations that must be established. Fauci lied, an allegation regarding a false representation. But what would be the material fact? Well, one might begin with the belief of 3 in 10 Americans by April 2020 that the virus was most likely created in a lab. On May 26, 2021, according to the President, the Director of National Intelligence, or DNI, and the intelligence community had coalesced around 2 possible origin theories. These are some experts, government experts, and had assigned a low to moderate probability that the novel coronavirus had not only been manipulated or cultivated in a laboratory, but had also escaped from that laboratory, giving some support to the claims that Dr. Anderson had early tried to dismiss and describe as crackpot theories, and which Dr. Fauci had by January 2021 described as shiny objects distracting attention. But identifying one solid statement by at least clear and convincing evidence, on July 17, 2021, over a year into the public health crisis, Dr. Fauci, the most trusted voice in the pandemic, according to Al Jazeera, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, NIAID, told CNN's Jim Costa, we have this by clear and convincing evidence. This is what he said, a quote, the most likely explanation is a natural evolution from an animal reservoir to a human. Is that a false representation? Now he's couched it somewhat. He's saying it's most likely. So he's giving himself some wiggle room. But is that a false representation, or in layman's terms, a lie about a material fact made intentionally and knowingly with intent to mislead? That is what must be established in a court to even begin a case based upon fraud. And remember, we're not Dr. Fauci, so we can't just go with it's wholly conceivable. Now, for a moment, let's build just a little bit on this rule analysis to bring in a legal cause of action alleging conspiracy. Because under the rule stated in U.S. v. Pritchard, all parties to a conspiracy need not be named in the indictment. And under U.S. v. Elliott, a bit of a force multiplier in court. Once the conspiracy has been established, the government need show only slight evidence that a particular person or persons were members of the conspiracy. And moreover, a party to a conspiracy need not even know the identity or even the number of his confederates. For this analysis, U.S. v. Elliott is an important case because, as that court explained, the essential element of a chain conspiracy, allowing persons unknown to each other and never before in contact to be jointly prosecuted as co-conspirators, is interdependence. The scheme, which is the object of the conspiracy, must depend on the successful operation of each link in the chain. An individual associating himself with a chain conspiracy knows that it has a scope, and that for its success it requires an organization wider than may be disclosed by his personal participation. And a jury is entitled to infer the existence of an enterprise on the basis of largely or wholly circumstantial evidence, to include even slight evidence of association. This analysis was important in that case because These facts led that court to speak in terms of a wheel conspiracy, in which one person, the hub of the wheel, was accused of conspiring with several others, the spokes of the wheel. And clear and convincing evidence would establish the fact that, as reported by Al Jazeera in April 2020, Dr. Fauci had become the trusted voice in the United States in separating fact and fiction, and all Americans were urged to heed his wise counsel. This would be a fiduciary relationship, or a relationship based upon trust, with a heightened sense of duty in reasonable care, in which means of knowledge and the duty of using them are in equity the equivalent of knowledge itself, according to the Supreme Court in Cordova v. Hood, which would be an important element of proof to establish a detrimental reliance that would have resulted in not just a conceivable or even just plausible, but actual and direct injury. Speculation is eschewed by courts, and it is a necessary finding in fact for a prima facie case of fraud. Could a reasonable trier of fact conclude by at least clear and convincing evidence that Dr. Fauci, the director of NIAID, often described as the leading infectious disease control expert, under this analysis, in fact, lie about the natural evolution of a novel coronavirus? This is the case that must be proven in a court.
I keep an open mind and say that we should consider all possibilities until we definitively prove one. But I, together with many highly qualified vaccinologists and virologists, including a recent paper by 21 internationally renowned virologists and evolutionary biologists from all over the world, indicate that although we keep an open mind, that it's possible, entirely possible, that it could be, as they say, a lab leak. That the most likely explanation is a natural evolution from an animal reservoir to a human. Once you say that, which I believe is the more likely, you gotta make sure you emphasize that you still keep an open mind to all possibilities, including the lab. I rely on people like that who have great experience in this. That's what they do every single day. Who again are open-minded in saying it's wholly conceivable that you may have had a lab leak. So you've got to keep an open mind of all possibilities. But they feel that the more likely explanation is a mutual evolution from an animal host to a human.
Keeping an open mind, in July 2021, the president's top medical advisor, Dr. Anthony Fauci, dismissed the fact that viruses and their virions are the most abundant biological particles in the world, and that before a novel coronavirus, there were only a total of 219 harmful viruses to mankind, making the emergence of a new virus threat to mankind extremely remote. Keeping an open mind, in July 2021, the president's top medical advisor, Dr. Anthony Fauci, dismissed the fact that this was only the 7th coronavirus to infect humans, even though there are over 3,000 coronaviruses that infect mammals and over 3,000 that infect birds. Keeping an open mind, in July 2021, the president's top medical advisor, Dr. Anthony Fauci, dismissed the fact that between 2003 and 2005, a total of 5 human coronaviruses had suddenly been alleged to have zoonotically evolved, including SARS, which had first erupted in China in 2003. Keeping an open mind, Dr. Fauci dismissed the findings of Wade G in March of 2020 that this particular novel coronavirus had what was described as an Ovidian codon usage bias. This is a species-specific test for affinity of a virus. And even though there are over 3,000 coronaviruses that infect mammals and over 3,000 coronaviruses that infect birds, there are no coronaviruses that infect reptiles or snakes, making this finding at least suspect. But Dr. Fauci did couch his remarks with the statement that we should consider all possibilities until we definitively prove one. And he did claim that he was in agreement or associated together with many highly qualified vaccinologists and virologists, including a recent paper by 21 internationally renowned virologists and evolutionary biologists from all over the world, appealing at least to a logical fallacy of authority, but also providing at least some circumstantial evidence of association and agreement, and providing no evidentiary, clinical, or empirical basis for its conclusion. Dr. Fauci claimed on July 17, 2021, that the most likely explanation is a natural evolution from an animal reservoir to a human. Yet and still, as discussed in a previous video, as the head of an executive agency, Dr. Fauci would enjoy essentially a rebuttable presumption of infallibility under the doctrine of regulatory deference, as announced in the 1984 Supreme Court case Chevron USA v. NRDC. And the only way to shift that burden to Dr. Fauci would be to establish that his findings were not just debatable, but clearly erroneous. And a finding is clearly erroneous only when, although there is evidence to support it, the reviewing court on the entire evidence is left with a definite and firm conviction that a mistake has been committed. Did Dr. Fauci lie? This was the basis of a request for information under the FOIA to the White House on March 23, 2021, to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that Dr. Fauci knew or should have known that the novel coronavirus could only have originated in a laboratory, with no possibility that it had naturally evolved. The FOIA was presented to the President, the head of the executive branch, which under Executive Order 12958 is the ultimate original classification authority, nothing higher, nothing superseding the President. This was the basis of a request for information under the FOIA to the White House on March 23, 2021, to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that Dr. Fauci knew or should have known that the novel coronavirus could only have originated in a laboratory. The FOIA was presented to the President, the head of the executive branch, which under Executive Order 12958 is the ultimate original classification authority. That FOIA request sought to determine whether basic metrics, specifically infectious dose and or secondary attack rate, which had yet to be published by the CDC, were classified information because the presentation of the disease and the pandemic had belied what had been published in other scientific reports about COVID-19. However, under Executive Order 12958, these metrics could not be classified unless the government owned or controlled the causative biological agent for COVID-19. The deadline told for that FOIA request on April 20th, 2021. Webb v. Fauci was filed after the President had already tasked the DNI and the intelligence community to obtain a response from the White House on July 7, 2021, a matter that had been elevated all the way to the Supreme Court on the shadow docket, and in which, under a presumptive assertion of executive privilege reserved for matters of national security, the White House refused to enter an appearance or a written reply to the nation's highest court or any lower court. And as of March 7th, 2022, when the Supreme Court ruled on that matter on the shadow docket, the presumptive claim of executive privilege was transformed into a Glomar statement that the government could neither confirm nor deny that the infectious dose and or secondary attack rate for COVID-19 were classified information. But under Molecular Pathology Associates v. Myriad Genetics, Inc., the government could only own or control this novel coronavirus if it had been cultivated or manipulated in a lab. With regard to Dr. Fauci's statements, the situation is analogous to the fact presented to the court during the trial of Adolf Eichmann, and that court had found most dispositive the fact that undoubtedly he knew the tale of the administration of the tonics to which he had put his signature. This briefing is unclassified. Stay tuned for the next episode on Capturing COVID-19 True Crime Stories. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for state delegate in Virginia's 49th district. No man is above the law. Honest. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.